welcome everybody for another recording of 404 Policy Not Found, podcast episode number 4. And we are here joined by Theodora Skeadas. And Renee, take us away.
Theo, so happy to have you with us. I know, where are you today?
Great question. I do travel a lot. I'm in Cambridge, Massachusetts right now, which is home base for me.
Okay, great. Okay, well, because yes, you are a world traveler, and every time I see a social post from you, you are in a different place and doing something amazing.
Thank you.
And yeah, just kind of kicking ass generally. No, I think, you do a lot of important things. You and I met, first of all, at an All Tech is Human event in New York last summer, and that's a big community of people who are really thinking about and are committed to building a wide and interdisciplinary community of responsible technology folks. But on top of that, you work with DoorDash in the community manager. You are working with Ramon Chowdhury on Humane Intelligence, trying to do AI auditing and red teaming on really important issues. And you were in Canada recently for the W7, which was a pre-event to the G7. Just like, I'm always just like, oh wow, how does she have time for all of that? There must be 4 of her. And so I just wanted to actually just be able to have a chance to talk to you, because you come from this trust and safety space, and it's a space I think that people here understand a little bit, but I want to kind of be able to get a little bit more nuance into what that looks like. But before we get into all of that, I actually just want to know, can you tell people who you are and what it is that you tell people that you do?
Yeah, no, it's a great question and honestly not so easy to answer. So I can share that I started out my work in international development. I was working in the Middle East, North Africa region. Around the height of the Arab Spring, which was a really interesting time to be in the region because it introduced me to a whole bunch of complex questions around the role of technology in society. At the time, Twitter was becoming a full force in enabling really critical conversations to happen. Change resulted from the conversations, at least in part, that happened on Twitter's platform. And so many other social media companies at that time were growing rapidly and influencing world events. I did my master's in public policy after that. And after that, I went and worked in the national security ecosystem for a few years, where I was doing research on public sentiment and other issues, specifically when it comes to political, economic, and military activity. I was focused on the Middle East, North Africa regions, as well as Eastern Europe and the Sahel region of Africa. And I transitioned from that open source intelligence work, where I was doing that in support of the US government, directly into tech. So went from civil society to sort of consulting for government, and then ultimately found myself in the sort of trust and safety ecosystem. I worked at Twitter for a few years, where I in part facilitated our Trust and Safety Council, which was Twitter's largest public consultative body of civil society organizations across the world, looking at issues like child sexual exploitation, and mental health and suicide. And I also supported a Trusted Flaggers program for human rights defenders, and supported a research initiative around trust and safety themes. And I also supported our global transparency, crisis response, and elections work. And after the layoffs, became independent for a little while, working with all kinds of organizations, including governments and civil society and companies, thinking about the intersection of technology and society. And then I found myself joining in a part-time capacity a nonprofit called Humane Intelligence that does AI evaluation. So thinking about how to assess AI models for different kinds of harm, whether it's factuality issues like inaccurate results or bias. And then I joined DoorDash as the community policy manager last summer, where I look at issues of safety, quality, fraud, and identity. So just to give a sense, like, it is an interesting ecosystem here at DoorDash because it's a online platform that has real world or offline ramifications. It's not like Twitter, which really just happened online, but could impact world events. But DoorDash exists in both spaces. And so there are real interesting questions that arise in trust and safety when you have online to offline interactions. And it's not a traditional marketplace, it's a 3-pronged marketplace, because we have the merchants who are making the food, we have the people who are ordering the food, the customers, and then we have the dashers, the people who deliver the food. And so you have interactions across each of those ecosystems. And yeah, I'm still in quite active in civil society, in groups like All Tech is Human and Integrity Institute, and and continue to be quite active in other spaces. But yeah, really looking at the world of trust and safety, or safety and integrity in the online sphere through a number of different avenues.
Fantastic.
Such a fantastic work you're doing. I am right now very focused on the aspect of safety and responsible and alignment. Simply because what I'm discovering more and more convinced now, there's like the role of the safeguards that need to be imposed on AI and innovation that is so big has to rely on the hands of civic society as the driver's seat. Not talking about just being a part of the group, but also actually being in the driver's seat, because it comes down to like conflict of interest and like, we civic society are going to have humanity's best interest at hand than other groups. So good work. So yeah, at some point I would like to talk to, maybe not outside this podcast.
Sure.
I want to just follow through on, the thread of knowing you a little bit more, and what we like to do is, try to ask some questions that will distill some wisdom which you have done. So yeah, so as we have been saying, very well, wear many hats, and, you crisscross tech policy, governance, community engagement, etc. What do you think is like the unifying thread in all of those many hats you wear? If you had to pick, what is the
Yeah.
unifying thread of all those things that drives you
hmm
to do all those things?
Yeah, I think it's that like I am not fundamentally a technologist. I'm really a humanist. I'm interested in helping humanity thrive, and finding solutions to complex social problems that we face. And I see that technology is changing the way we interact with ourselves and each other. And so I'm interested in trying to help elevate conversations, discourse, and ultimately changes to make the interactions that we have with the technology in our lives better. And because it interacts with so many parts of our lives, it means that I'm interacting in different parts of that ecosystem. So whether it's the gendered impacts of technology or mental health impacts, child safety impacts, like I do touch on a lot of different themes because technology is so wide ranging in its impact on society.
Yeah, and I mean, I think just given that story, like there does seem to be this push. I mean, if you read like the narratives of the companies, and if you look at what their agendas are, and if you look at the competition that ends up existing for our limited attention and time, and I mean, now we're into algorithmic pricing where people are basically companies are trying to extract whatever remaining consumer surplus is left over. Like there is this erosion of human agency by a range of ways technology is already and is trying to intercede in our lives. So how do we recenter humans? How do we move towards a more humanist vision of technology?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that change can happen from within and it can happen also from without. And both of those interventions are important to undertake. So if, on the inside, right, a role like mine, a trust and safety type job, is intended to improve the company's platform experience policy so that users have better experiences. So I'll just give one example. At DoorDash, we have a tool, Safe Chat Plus, that is actually AI powered and combating abuse and harassment in chats between dashers and customers so that if there's some sort of a harmful interaction that gets detected, the conversation is paused and the harmful interaction doesn't continue. So there are tooling solutions that companies can implement that help address the harmful experiences that users can have on these platforms. So that's just one example. And of course, policies as well, depending on the ecosystem, can change and improve the user experience. And then Norman, as you alluded to, there's sort of the external side of things as well. So government has a role to play, and civil society is a really important forcing function for better and more informed government regulation, right, which can happen through the legislative branch and or the executive branch. So, for example, we saw a few days ago the U.S. executive orders on AI. There were three of them, and an AI action plan. And I'm not going to say that I agree with that, but it's an example of a government trying to change how AI is procured by its agencies, right, and how it's and also like investment in data centers and infrastructure and like that sort of changing the landscape in the way that it views it to be correct. Obviously, in this deeply partisan moment, that's a very controversial set of statements, but that's an executive branch intervention. Legislative branch interventions are ones that are done through bills that then get discussed and ultimately passed on a whole bunch of issues around transparency and watermarking, deep fakes, elections. I mean, there's a whole bunch of different legislative discussions that are underway that can then, force the government to require companies to change behaviors.
Yeah, I'm just going to follow on that quickly because, of course, the big beautiful bill sort of had this moratorium that
Yeah.
thankfully did not get through in the final version, but it doesn't seem like that's necessarily the end of the story. And I guess I do have a question in this moment in time where there is, I mean, but what is clear is that Marco Rubio was sent down the road to basically go and attack EU's tech policy right now. For countries like Canada, which are much smaller and that don't have the weight of an economic place, how do you think international countries and states that support this type of legislation can collaborate effectively to try to build a coalition for this type of work?
Yeah, I have so many thoughts on that. I think that, first of all, everyone is more powerful when they are working in collaboration with the people around them. In fact, there was a few months ago a conversation that professors at the Harvard Kennedy School hosted with alumni and just the wider public to talk about democratic degradation in the United States and what can be done to address it. And the one takeaway that I took specifically from Marshall Gans, who is a really long time active community organizer, is that whatever we do, we shouldn't do it alone. And that's something that I think applies here as well. So, when Canada is thinking about its role within this space, it can operate in partnership with others. So this can happen in a number of different ways. One example is collaborations with other governments that pool resources and try to bolster research and coordinated action. So, for example, the Global Partnership for Action on Gender-Based Online Harassment and Abuse is a partnership with about 12 different countries that have come together, and Canada is one of those countries. And last year we organized, I was part of this process, a conference in Nairobi, Kenya on gender disinformation that surfaced solutions that governments can take to address the issue of gendered disinformation, which is a kind of tech-facilitated gender-based violence. And so participation in multi-government efforts like that can be helpful. Governments can also fund projects independently. So, for example, the UK government, the Foreign Commonwealth Development Office, and the Department for Science Innovation and Technology recently funded Humane Intelligence to look at intimate image abuse, which is another kind of tech-facilitated gender-based violence, where we hosted workshops in Nigeria and in Colombia and actually talked about top-down solutions for addressing intimate image abuse. So I would say investing in development, in research, in civil society is one way of doing this. But also, of course, there's regulation. So governments can think about what regulatory best practices are evolving from other places and replicating them in the Canadian context. And of course, there's also using the tools that are at the government's disposal. So for example, most recently, as you noted earlier, Canada hosted the G7 convening in Kananaskis, and that's a convening of global stakeholders coming together, and like conversations can be fostered. So sometimes power can be leveraged through the convening of different stakeholders at moments when they are coming together, such as the G7. Yeah, those are some ways that I think government, Canada, for example, can think about influencing the development of technology.
Great. Norman?
Yeah, for me, you talk about a lot about innovation, and like you gotta see opportunities. For me, it has been the deep prioritization of concepts like EDI, and the concepts that are more open to to diversity and
Yeah.
thinking about different groups. And for me, the big problem has been this mindset of like the race. America's plan. If you look at the first page, it says America's AI Action Plan, but at the top it says winning the race. And the problem winning the race is that you're going to see doing work necessary work that you need to do for the people to be unnecessary because it's a hindrance to winning the race. When in China, they are just basically not by default not caring about any of the things that would procure actual benefit of people, but the benefit of the regimes. It's like just for me, it's like why we need this transparency and evaluation ways, because we need to hold and bring to light more into account of what's happening so that people can actually take that mindset.
Yeah.
Following on that, just asking about your reflections on we're thinking about public interest technology, want to think about tech for good, and what are some of the ways that maybe you have thought about, or when it comes to like how do we bring voices that are normally underrepresented, marginalized, because we also need their voices. Communities where probably the internet is broadband connections are not even are problems into I either conversations or just conversations about why we need to do policy.
And I mean, and I would add on to that, I mean, like Norman, like the fact that like there's, one of the executive orders was this anti-woke kind of executive order. So how do you kind of do that in this moment where there's an attack on that work?
But like when you include DI concepts and other like include the indigenous perspectives, for example, which we have as well, I think that's an strength as well. We can actually make better AI as a result because AI works within within the fundamental idea of context. The more context you give it, the more voice perspectives and open doors to that, the better it's going to be. So I think consequently, if you create models around taking into account, how what do we prioritize as a country, that can actually lead to better AI than what is being
Definitely.
created within the mindset of a race that has to be quick.
Yeah, I mean, that's a lot to unpack. I think there's a few questions that sort of surfaced from that. So for folks who are not aware, the U.S. recently launched, Donald Trump administration announced three executive orders and then a corresponding AI action plan. The three executive orders of them, the first got the bulk of the attention because of the language it used, preventing woke AI in the federal government, which means that it prohibits federal government agencies from procuring AI systems that it says embed ideological biases around critical race theory, DEI, intersectionality, and requiring that these models be truthful and ideologically neutral. The second was around the permitting of data center infrastructure, so fast track permitting these data centers so that we can develop them more quickly. And build out our infrastructure rapidly. And then the third was about promoting the export of the American AI technology stack. These ideas were not a one for one to the action plan, but they were very closely connected and much of it related. The plan itself was split into three parts: the Accelerate AI Innovation, which is about removing red tape and onerous regulation, enabling AI adoption. And then the second was around building American AI infrastructure. And then the third is leading in international AI diplomacy and security, which is very much leveraging this like countering Chinese influence in the international governance bodies type language. And so absolutely we're seeing, at least in the third part of the action plan, this rhetoric around economic competition as a national security issue, right? The national securitization of AI, which first of all, I think is a false paradigm. I don't think is one that benefits Americans. At the end of the day, right, what we want to do, and you said this, is that like AI should be used to improve the lives of Americans and all of us, right? Lower our energy bills, improve our healthcare systems, improve disaster response, make it such that our lives are materially better. It is not clear to me that investing in, for example, a data center infrastructure that fast tracks the development while circumventing environmental processes in places where there are clear environmental issues, areas that are prone to hurricanes or drought, right? Where the fast tracking of data centers may directly erode the quality of the environment is helping the lives of people in those areas. So I think that there's this real disconnect between this sort of arms race around building AI faster and the end result, which really should be improving the lives of people.
Here's one quick number on this just to augment to what you're saying. It's
Yeah.
like non people know that ChatGPT uses in terms of CO2 per query usage 4.32 grams of CO2. That's 4.32, whereas Grok does 0.17.
Wow. It's
So
very
by that,
powerful.
so by that measure alone, you will say, if I care about the environment, I'm gonna use Grok.
Yeah.
But that's not the only thing you should be thinking about when choosing to use an AI system, right? Because of course we will know that Grok is basically like DeepSeek of Elon, essentially. So yeah,
Yeah.
so there's so much to bring to light. I think that a lot of this stuff gets missed.
Yeah, and then just to sort of pull on that, I think that the question of this woke AI is such a to me a misframed one because it is one really hard to train models to produce the desired outcomes, and even the engineers that are developing these systems don't themselves really understand how these models are produced, like how the outputs are yielded from the models, right? There's a lot of research that's going into
Yeah.
those relationships causally, but also free of ideological bias. I mean, what does that even mean? Because at the end of the day, like you said, right, AI is produced by the inputs that we give it. And so, like, it just doesn't really make sense because AI will produce all kinds of different results. Ultimately, the devil is in the details, and I will be curious to see how he implements this concept of woke AI because it just, in practice, is just not how it plays out. Um,
I also think it just it's being let's say driven to benefit specific groups of people like the industries like GPT-5 just launched yesterday, and from all of the things that usually come about when it comes to evaluating an AI system, a lot of the benchmarks testing for math and coding and math, like if you watch GPT-5's presentation yesterday, it was positioned as like the best coder in the world, the best coder in the world. It does programming very well. It beats Claude, it's Gemini, etc. It's like if AI systems are being driven to benefit a specific group because they are making it to be most proficient at the areas that benefits them most, then also like we're giving a technology that's more suited for a specific group of people. It doesn't benefit everyone across the line. So that's why like I think
Yeah.
it's like constant transparency and like like seeing like how is it being driven, like that's it. We need to make it more, it's not being equitable by that nature.
Yeah, and that's part of why European regulation, I think, focuses on transparency as one of its core tenets. So the Digital Services Act, Digital Markets Act in the EU has transparency requirements that companies must comply with. But VLABs must comply with because it's so important that we get a better sense of what is happening behind the scenes. We as the
Yeah.
public.
And I mean, I think just piggybacking on that sort of that concept of this concentration of power of these kind of bigger companies and what, the EU in some of its policy uses the word gatekeepers. There's this bigger issue of the fact that there are these companies that are whether it's their monopolies or whether they just have an enormous influence and power, or whether they are creating risks. There is especially when it comes to companies that are using platforms that they already have that are dominant in society, and then potentially now using them in ways that are much riskier than what they might have done before. Um, you know, I think you and I shared the sort of the feeling that this monopoly by design model that is basically what Silicon Valley has sort of been trying to really push is at the root of a lot of the harmful ways in which technology is getting developed, or at least that's certainly my perception. And I wonder what we do about that. Because when the money is flowing to companies that are incentivized by a structure of funding that pushes them in this path, it strikes me that the incentives are not aligned for it, for the technologies we're trying to build, the technologies that would be good for society to be built. Those incentives are not aligned. So how do we deal with the concentration of power? How do we deal with these incentives that are pushing us in an unhealthy and unhuman direction?
Yeah, so there have been a number of efforts in the US to address consolidated power in recent years. There have been bills that have been put forward in states like Maine and New York, Minnesota, Massachusetts that are all trying to get at this issue of consolidated power. I'd say writ large, the issue is that with very few players, prices are controlled and outcomes may be less than ideal, right? That's what we see with monopolistic competition. Diverse options to choose from. You don't get competitive results, you get constrained, collaborated, or coordinated results. And what we've seen with companies that scale so rapidly is that often, like you say, they trend towards a reduced competitive environment. And this happens not just in like the services that we interact with that we, can see, but even things like cloud compute, right? There are only a few players that are really big in that space. And especially for spaces like compute, which sort of, and even I would say Twitter was, served this function as well. Like they are quasi utilities, right? And utilities have a natural tendency to consolidate because you actually want only a few providers. However, when they are operating in the private domain without appropriate guardrails, it produces outcomes that are not to the public's benefit. And so, I mean, there are a whole bunch of ways in which I'm starting to see regulatory approaches on this issue. So, defining monopoly and monopsony, trying to prevent exclusive dealing arrangements that lock out competitors, trying to stop predatory pricing designed to drive competitors out of business, preventing price coordination between dominant companies and suppliers, protecting the ability of workers to seek employment from multiple employers without constraints, and banning employee coordination that suppresses wages and benefits are some of the ways in which I've seen legislative and regulatory attempts, and of course under Lena Khan in the US, under the FTC and the Department of Justice in recent years. Under the Biden administration, we saw there was a lot of progress in that space. Of course, under the Trump administration, that is not the case. But yeah, I know there are organizations in Ottawa or in Canada that are looking to address this issue. I actually chatted recently with a Harvard Kennedy School classmate, although we didn't overlap, who works on this issue, Keldon, with the Canadian Anti-Monopoly Project, which is well acronymed as CAMP. So I know that there are efforts underway in Canada as well to address this issue because it affects Canadians just as much as it does us. Oh,
I'm
Renee, I
gonna,
don't hear
I'm
you.
gonna, ask, I'm gonna just do a little follow up if that's okay, Renee, since you're, yeah.
Sh- yeah.
So it's very hard to talk about, I think, to have any AI conversation without saying things that, like, people listen and are like, oh my God, that's worrying.
Yeah.
As Geoffrey Hinton just gave out a presentation, one of his presentations, and the title of that presentation was, "If you can sleep good at night tonight, you didn't get this presentation. You didn't get the why this presentation." So it's just getting back to like sort of like fundamentals, like we talk about concentration of power and the dangers behind that. We had the case of Sarah Wynne Williams, who is the former director of global public policy at Meta, Facebook and at Meta, who just came out talking about the ways in which Meta Llama was used by the Chinese government to, things like surveillance and censorship and other things that are very worrying we're not going to get into. But like, to me, like, I was already thinking that, there's a lot of stuff happening that shouldn't be happening when it comes to like AI innovation. And this just brought more light to it. Um, how do you like? What do you see the state? What do you think is like the thing to worry about if you need to worry about something specific aside from maybe things that we've been talking about around how AI is progressing?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think you just nailed it. Surveillance, right? We are entering, I mean, and we've known this for a few years, but we are moving very rapidly into a space where collaboration between technology companies that have access to huge amounts of data about Americans and all of us and a government that is adversarial means that they can coordinate and surveil the activities of Americans across a number of domains. So, for example, a few days ago, Donald Trump announced that he wanted to build a sort of coordinated healthcare database in collaboration with companies that, companies that are tracking the individual biometrics data that we produce when we attach these devices to our bodies. And so that initiative would give him access to, the administration access to data about our bodies and how our bodies are doing. We're seeing, for example, increased scrutiny of what is being said online and our protest activities, nonviolent protest activities, and like AI can enable surveillance in a way that allows the government to monitor activities and take action as a result. And we're seeing this happen more and more all over the world. I mean, it's deeply concerning.
Or maybe like determine with data, make predictions based on behaviors, perhaps.
Sure, sure. I mean, at the very least, it can be used to monitor and see what people are doing day to day, but it also certainly can be used to make predictive assessments.
And
Yeah,
also to manipulate. I mean, I think that, there's certainly been many instances of both platforms using their own tools for digital astroturfing to either undermine a policy or to push an agenda, to push narratives forward. We've seen, obviously interference in elections and so on. And so it just strikes me that when you get to AI and you're now basically training models on people's brains, your ability to manipulate is much higher, and there's still no guardrails on that. And so, yeah, I mean, how do you think about how we should be handling that? I mean, I know that it maybe you do a bunch of work on red teaming and AI audit assessments. So have you ever done any on these chatbot models, and what are you finding if you have been?
Yes, no, we certainly have. So we've looked at models, a number of different models in many different contexts to assess where harms are arising. So, for example, we organized an event with the government of Singapore last fall to look at multicultural and multilingual bias that evolves when different models are interacted with. And we brought folks together from 10 East, Southeast, and South Asian countries to Singapore to look at where linguistic and cultural biases evolve, and found that in many contexts, the red teamers, the people participating in the exercise, were able to break the guardrails that have been created around the models to produce outputs that were violative of the constraints that we were imposing. We've also looked at the issue of gendered bias with UNESCO in France last year. We looked at Islamophobia in Europe, in Brussels, with a group, a nonprofit that's based there. That was a very easy guardrail to break, unfortunately. Not a surprise, though. We looked at the issue of we also have red teamed frameworks. So, for example, we worked with the National Institute for Standards and Technology in the US to assess part of the AI risk management framework that they authored. And we were able, to see where the framework could be useful, but also what improvements might be made to make it clearer and more applicable. But yeah, we have found pretty consistently that like this kind of approach, right, red teaming, assessing for vulnerabilities is a way to surface where improvements can be made.
Sorry, what are you seeing? Like, how do you see the value of the red teaming exercises? Because it strikes me that it's both, like, in terms of, there's a couple of pieces that I see from my end. So one is that you're actually surfacing some issues in terms of what kind of harms are enabled by platforms, but there's also, it strikes me, a capacity building exercise for people to recognize and understand what's going on. So can you just talk to me a little bit about what you see the value as being?
Yeah, I'll give you an example. I do think that this serves a great educational purpose. So I was doing like a workshop or conversation recently with folks in Ghana. It was a virtual conversation. And at the end of it was on responsible AI. There was a LinkedIn post that was made. Theodora Skeadas, Deputy Director of the Executive Office of Technology, Services and Security, blah, blah, blah. And I wrote to the organizer and I said, that isn't my job. That's not what I do. And he said, oh my, AI must have misled me. And I was like, yeah, it did. It did. You could have checked my LinkedIn and seen that you could have fact checked it. You could have asked me, what about consent? Right? Like you literally could have, there's a whole bunch of ways that this could have gone down differently. And it was really striking to me because this person is teaching people about responsible AI use. And so clearly upskilling, education, like this is really important because whether or not we want to, we are interacting with these systems every day. We may be able to limit the interactions to some extent and we can try to, but like you can't escape them entirely. It's very hard to. And so it's important that people understand what responsible engagement looks like and that they can be in the driver's seat. And so I agree that red teaming has an educational purpose in addition to a model corrective purpose.
But I mean, like following up on that, like, I mean, in my experience writing, for example, a grant, I can write a perfectly decent generic grant. But if I'm actually going to go through and do fact checking and footnoting and make sure that I'm not having hallucinations in my citations and like use wording that I feel is really contextual, I don't feel like I save that much time using AI. In fact, I'm pretty sure that in some cases I've used more time trying to get AI to behave the way that I want it to. But that's because I'm a little bit like, I don't know, very intentional about how I talk about certain things. I care about how how I show up in the world in that sense. But there's not that other people don't, but there is this push to automate things. And so like because there is this big disconnect between people who are trying to automate and people who care, I wonder what that is going to do to us.
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, not everything can and not everything should be automated. Recently, I was at a convening in Princeton, Shaping the Future of AI, where we were talking about executive branch officials around the United States were talking about AI implementation in their states, right? Like what kinds of chatbots and other tools can be useful to help Americans benefit from the bounty of AI. And there were some hard conversations about, where the limitations are. Yes, it can be useful if trained, if effective, but it can also be harmful. It needs to be tested. It needs to be sandboxed and thoughtfully implemented and iterated upon. And none of this is inexpensive or, easy. It's time consuming. It's financially costly. It is, it has the potential to hurt people, right? If poor benefits decisions are made. that
Yeah.
are algorithmically recommended, people could lose access to their benefits, their
Mhm.
government, authorized benefits. It has real world implications.
Mhm.
And I also, Renee, totally agree with what you were saying. I started a part-time PhD program last year at King's
Of course you
College
did.
London. Yeah, I know, right? In my free time in the Department of War Studies. I was like, well, let's see if AI can be helpful. And it outputted, because I was looking for research ideas,
Yeah.
so much fake information.
Yeah.
Ideas that seemed accurate. It sounded
Plausible.
really good. It's very plausible, but
Yeah.
just didn't exist. It wasn't a real book. It wasn't a real article. Like the URL didn't work. And I remember going back and forth and I just gave up. I was like, okay, this is not actually helping me.
Mhm.
Maybe there are ways in which it can be helpful, but definitely not in every way.
Yeah, no, this,
Certainly not, I think, when it comes to things that are forward looking. Like I think, AI is
Yeah,
like, to the extent that it can do things, it's better at kind of like building on what has happened before,
yeah,
uh, historical data, not at sort of like imagining
yeah.
some new future that doesn't exist.
Yeah, I mean, I
I'm
was prompting it for historical information,
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
like books that had been written or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry.
both had a chance to test GPT-5 that got launched yesterday.
Oh
Like
yeah.
one of the things they claim is like we would reduce the hallucination by like a lot.
Great.
Apparently, some people
That's
have
important.
some people have been saying that.
Well, we should
Uh,
test it and find out if that's an
yeah,
accurate statement.
Yeah.
no,
So let me at
uh,
them.
yeah. As we are nearing the end of the podcast, I'm just gonna ask one question that we usually kind of try thinking about the future because you hinted about the future. And then I'll let Renee have a closing reflection or question, and then after that
Great.
we'll come to a close. Yeah, so I think like when it comes to do any kind of work, we need to have an idea in mind about the future. So like if we ask you to imagine what does a safe and prosperous AI future look like, if you have all the ones and you can turn all the keys, Theodora, how would that future be? How would you shape it? How does that look like? That
Yeah.
ideal scenario that would like to
hmm
make happen.
Yeah. I mean, to me, it's the idea that technology puts us in the driver's seat where we can make independent, personalized decisions about how we want to interact with technology, how we want it to help us live our lives better in ways that work for us, and where there is transparency, accountability, reciprocity, and co-ownership, right? Like that to me is like the utopian vision for tech. And I think that the only way that we can get there is if we all, and Norman, you alluded to this earlier, like everyone has a role to play, and we
Mhm.
need all voices, including and especially voices from historically marginalized communities that often don't get a seat at the table, but who are often the most impacted adversely by these technologies. And so need to be at these tables physically and virtually, metaphorically, every table, because whether or not we choose to engage in the process of shaping this tech, it will impact our lives. And so
Mhm.
I think that joining civil society groups that are trying to change the dialogue, do research, engage in legislative advocacy, right? Or engaging in other ways. Joining All Tech is Human, which is a great community. There are
Mhm.
so many ways that we can have a role in shaping this future for ourselves.
Joining Goodbot. Yeah, so thanks, Theo. And I mean, just really pulling out from that conversation, I think, you and I agree a lot on that, like where people are in control. I think one of the here were, the frames that, we've heard tech executives use in the past is we're just giving people what they want, but it sort of misses this, to the extent that that's true at all, it's more about your impulse rather than your aspirations. And I think that I think this piece about how do we kind of recenter our aspirations, how do we recenter, like, I think the overwhelm that people feel of like having to just navigate so many apps
Yeah.
and not being able to just sort of do basic functions because we can't choose. Like there's something about how there's a
I mean,
toxic,
even
like, yeah,
Renee, you sent me the notes, right? Like the question, some of the
yeah,
discussion ideas, and it was
yeah,
like, was it on LinkedIn message? Was it in my personal
yeah,
email? Was it in my human intelligence email? Was it over text? Was it over WhatsApp? Like there are so many communication channels we're using
yeah,
these days to communicate with
yeah,
each other. The disaggregation of channels creates so much cognitive load for us.
yeah.
because we're ships passing, it makes the coordination so much harder.
Yeah, which actually strikes me as an opportunity.
It can be, certainly.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I feel like there's business opportunities in this for,
Sure.
people who care about like trying to make our lives less
Mhm.
overwhelming. Really, my final question to you is, Theo, like we're in an intense moment in time in history. The U.S.
Yeah.
is obviously going through a unprecedented transition. I do want to. I do want to know how you're doing, but also, of course, there's several major global conflicts that are going on. There's, the cutting of aid internationally. It's a lot. So how do you, I guess, first of all, how are you doing? And then how are you staying hopeful, I guess, in this moment in time? And yeah, yeah, that's my
Yeah.
question.
No, it's very hard. I will say I feel very privileged in that I have stable work for now, for now. And family that is supportive. I have American citizenship. I'm US born. I don't struggle with immigration uncertainty, right? Which so many people do. My husband is a naturalized citizen. And I watched his process. It was a challenging one. So I take I take solace in the many privileges that I benefit from. And it's a hard time here and abroad. And I think I'm careful about my information intake. I try to read the news in a constrained fashion so that I'm getting the information, but it's not throughout the day. Because otherwise I find it honestly hard to motivate myself to be productive because I'm feeling quite worn down by these dynamics, these changes. And I also try to take comfort in the work that I'm doing. For me, challenge forces me to take action. That's sort of my natural impulse. And
Mm.
so I'm happy that there are productive outlets that I can apply my energies to. And in solidarity with friends and community members and individuals like yourself who are also trying to move things in a more positive direction. I know I'm not alone in this, and that gives me a lot of hope and optimism.
Yeah, I think seeing how many people and how many different ways people are coming at these issues, and that
Definitely.
it's a global movement that has a lot of people power, that to me feels
Yeah.
really promising. Like it has the potential to shift this, if we
Oh yeah.
kind of can come together.
I
Yeah.
And with that, I'm just gonna thank you because yeah, we're reached at the end. Yeah, I mean, so always astounded by the number of people that we tend to meet in this podcast and just like so aligned and so aligned. And like the reason why we collaborated with Renee is because we're aligned in so many things. So it just makes sense to do things together. So I would very much like to see this opportunity to just understand how we might, if there's anything that because we seem aligned on a lot of things. Yeah, such a pleasure to have you join us. Thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
having that conversation with
Thank
us.
you, Steve.
My
Listeners,
pleasure. No, thanks for inviting me. This was a lot of fun.
it's anything,
And come
anything you
on
want
up,
to say,
for a visit sometime.
anything
I'd love
like
to.
any last thought or like anything you want to share,
Yeah.
highlight for people to know about,
Yeah.
or
Calls to action.
Yeah, I think joining All Tech is Human is a
Yeah.
really easy one. There's a Slack community. There's so much happening there. Reading, like there's so many just folks reading and learning about this ecosystem. I think also joining groups that are taking action and working with others is something that I think folks can do, whether it's showing up at legislative hearings, right, to share their perspectives, or writing op-eds, or speaking to their legislators. Like there is just so much that individuals can do to add their voices into the mix. And I think we all should be doing that.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Theo. We will look forward to having more conversations down the road.
Same here. Thank you.
Take care.